Yo, what is going on, everyone? My name is Nick, or the Notorious Fantasy, and in today's video, we're going to be breaking down every single matchup of week number 16 of the 2024 fantasy football season and discussing whether you should start or sit the wide receivers in every single game. But before we can get into things, I would like to ask that if you guys are new to the channel and you do end up enjoying today's video, that you please make sure to hit that subscribe button down below. And while you're down there, whether you are new to the channel or not, please make sure that you do leave a like on today's video. It would help me out a ton. If you want to follow me on Twitter or X, please do so at NotoriousFantasy. So without further ado, let's get into my week number 16 wide receiver start or sit decisions for the 2024 fantasy football season. We begin with Thursday Night Football, the Denver Broncos at the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, Courtland Sutton did end up cooling down last week coming out of the bye as the wide receiver 32 up against the Indianapolis Colts. He ended up only having 3 receptions on 9 targets for 32 yards and a touchdown, but he was largely a casualty of the fact that Bo Nix ended up throwing 3 interceptions in that game. Prior to last week, he was a locked and loaded top 24 option, and he has had 3 top 6 showings over the last 6 games, and the Chargers defense is a solid matchup for wide receivers as they allow the 12th most amount of points on a per game basis to the wide receiver position. So assuming that Nix ends up actually locking in and playing halfway decent in this game, I do feel as though Courtland Sutton will be able to finish as a low-end wide receiver 1. For the other Broncos, Devon Bell had his time in the limelights from week 10 through 12 with some solid production, but ever since then, over the last 2 games, he has had just 1 total catch, and in my opinion, he is unstartable. Now, when it comes to Marvin Mims Jr., he's one of those guys that will just randomly catch a nuclear warhead from Bo Nix every once in a while and score a big touchdown, but with that being super unpredictable, and honestly, with Marvin Mims not having the highest amount of usage on a per game basis, I don't think anyone should be playing him. For the LA Chargers, Ladd McConkey returned last week to be a top 24 wide receiver up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He had 5 receptions on 7 targets for 58 yards and a touchdown as the wide receiver 23. The first time these two teams ended up playing did not go too well for Ladd McConkey as the wide receiver 45, but that was back in week number 6 before the offense really started to heavily focus on Ladd McConkey. So with Ladd being so reliable as of recently, I do feel as though he's a solid mid-range, middle-of-the-road wide receiver 2 on the week. Now, Quentin Johnston ended up actually having like these fugazi practice reports come out about him. The initial thought was, hey, maybe he's not going to play. He did not participate in practice initially on the week, but it turned out he actually ended up practicing both on Monday and Tuesday, and that was all just some wrong reporting. I don't know how you have wrong reporting in the NFL, but that's just how it goes right now. QJ has had back-to-back games inside the top 25, but ultimately I do feel like this ends up falling apart like that Post Malone song up against the Broncos defense, who are great up against wide receivers. So while QJ has kind of had this nice insanity run recently, I think it all comes to a close this week. Now, Joshua Palmer's targets bounce around more than Jessica Simpson's rack in Dukes of Hazzard, so I definitely do not trust him at all. He could just as easily get 3 targets as I could see him getting like 8, and either way, even if he gets fucking 12 targets, he probably finishes outside the top 30, so I would be staying away like he's got the cheese touch. Next up, we got the Houston Texans at the Kansas City Chiefs, the first of 2 games on Saturday. Now, Nico Collins had a fine showing up against my Dolphins as the wide receiver 22 last week with 4 receptions on 6 targets for 17 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, scoring 2 fucking touchdowns and only finishing as the wide receiver 22 reeks to high heaven, but sometimes things don't go and end up going your way, right? Prior to that, he was a top 12 wide receiver in back-to-back games, and even with CJ Stroud not really playing the best. Let's be honest, not playing up to snuff, Nico, in my opinion, is still a must-start top 6 wide receiver on the week in Kansas City. Now, if you had drafted Tank Dell, honestly, this guy has just been a disaster for a majority of the season. Drafting him really felt like you shot yourself in the leg inside of a club, like your name was Plaxico Burress. I can't even guarantee at this point in the season, without Stephon Diggs, that he even gets 3 targets, so there is no need to be playing him. For John Mechie, he is dealing with a shoulder injury and has now missed back-to-back practices. If Mechie is out, then Robert Woods will operate as the wide receiver 3. Regardless, though, you don't want to play who the wide receiver 3 on the Houston Texans is. For the Kansas City Chiefs, now, I don't want to sound like some conspiracy theorist, like I've got a tinfoil hat on when I say this, but it honestly is starting to feel like maybe Mahomes is faking his injuries, or he's just a great actor and he's kind of just overemphasizing what is going on, because you watch the guy walk off the field last week like he stepped on a trap during the Vietnam War, and then magically he's just good to go in this game. And this isn't the first instance of this happening. This isn't just a one-off, oh, Mahomes is this fucking Fugaz quarterback who gets hurt and then acts like his fucking leg's gonna get amputated, right? A couple of years ago, I believe it was 2 years ago, prior to when they won the Super Bowl, and he gets hurt in the playoffs, and it looks like his season's over. It looks like he's finished. It is all over. And then he takes like a Percocet at fucking halftime and comes back out in the second half. And it's just weird. Like, it always looks like it's over. It looks like it's finished. The season's over. The Chiefs are finally gonna lose. And then he's just back. And I'm not rooting for Patrick Mahomes to get hurt. I like Patrick Mahomes. He seems like a nice guy. He's the greatest quarterback in the NFL right now, even though he's not playing that way. But it's just fucking weird. It's weird, let's be honest, right? But when it comes to the wide receivers, the part of today's video that you guys came for, DeAndre Hopkins, as I've been preaching about, is just kind of the Webster's Dictionary definition of mid. In a revenge game spot, I do expect him to be fine, but I would be lying to you if I wanted to give this guy a real hype up. So to me, he's kind of in the desperation range as a wide receiver number 4. Now, Xavier Worthy went off last week in Cleveland. He was the wide receiver 16, 6 receptions on 11 targets for 46 yards and 3 rushes for 30 yards and a touchdown. With Worthy, he is one of the most boom or bust wide receivers in the game, and even with the Texans defense allowing the 7th most amount of points on a per game basis to wide receivers, with his production being super unreliable, I would stay away. Now, Hollywood Brown, Marquise Brown, has now logged 2 straight full sessions of practice, which is a good indicator that he might be good enough to play. Now, regardless, even if he does play, I think they're going to end up using the just the tip technique with him and kind of ease him in over the next couple of weeks. So that makes Juju Smith-Schuster completely irrelevant, and it also would make Hollywood Brown completely irrelevant as well. Final game on Saturday here, the Pittsburgh Steelers at the Baltimore Ravens. Zay Flowers is going to be a start. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Nick, Zay Flowers has been straight up ass, shout out Violet Myers, over the last 5 games. He has scored over 10 points in 4 out of those 5 games, so he hasn't been a complete and utter disaster, but he has still been far from ideal. Now, at this point, even with my expectation and what your expectation should be, he gets 6 to 7 targets plus a week. I will truly just have to hold my tongue on believing in Flowers, but I don't want to jump ship too early, because I know the second I say, guys, sit Zay Flowers, sit him down, he'll be like the wide receiver 5. At this point, he's just a high upside, high end wide receiver 3. For the rest of the Ravens, Rashad Master Bateman ended up being the guy that had a great game. He put the Giants in the Wuchie finger hold last week as the wide receiver 10. 3 receptions on 5 targets for 80 yards and 2 touchdowns. To fully understand the roller coaster ride, the experience that is Rashad Bateman, we're just going to go back to the game prior to last week, which was week number 13 up against the Eagles, where he had 0 targets. So there are high highs and low lows with Bateman, and this season we really haven't seen a single instance of him smashing in back-to-back games. And with him dealing with a foot injury, I would smash the brake here. You know, fucking, you ever, when you're learning how to drive and you're kind of, you know, you're not smashing the brake enough, you know, you're kind of tapping it, you're easing it in, and then the fucking driving instructor's like, fucking smash the brake, right? I'm smashing the brake here on Rashad Bateman. Now, Tylan Wallace, probably is the wide receiver 3 because Nelson Aguilar is in the concussion protocol, and if he misses, the safe assumption would be that Wallace will operate as the wide receiver 3, and you are not playing the wide receiver 3 in a Ravens offense, especially a guy with the skill set of Wallace, who frankly really isn't all that good. Now, George Pickens missed the last 2 weeks for the Steelers with a hamstring injury, and he has not practiced yet this week. This is something to monitor, as if he plays, you wouldn't want to throw him out there. The safe assumption, though, is just to assume that he's going to end up missing. Jefferson or Calvin Austin or Mike Williams will end up, one of them, probably having a halfway decent game. But ultimately, I don't want to play the guessing game here, so I would just sit them all. Next up, we got Sunday, 1 p.m., the start of the Sunday slate. The New York Football Giants at the hot Atlanta Falcons. But before we break this game down at the wide receiver position and the rest of the games on the week, I would like to give you guys a quick word from our friends and our partner over at Underdog. If you're brand new to Underdog and sign up using promo code Notorious, you will get your free pick, which today is going to be LA Chargers quarterback Justin Herbert, higher than half of a total yard, plus a first-time deposit offer of up to $1,000 in bonus cash. So if you sign up using promo code Notorious or click on the link in the video description, you will get your free pick. Now, if you're watching this after Thursday Night Football already kicks off, then you receive either an NBA player higher than half a total point or a different NFL player higher than half a total yard. You're going to want to match Justin Herbert with any other player playing on the Broncos or anyone playing in the NFL in week 16, just not on the Chargers. And if both of your picks hit, you'll get 3 times what you put in your pick'em. If you put in multiple other picks, they'll have to hit, but the payout will be higher. So make sure you guys check that out. Promo code Notorious, or by clicking on the link in the video description, you get your free pick plus a first-time deposit offer of up to $1,000 in bonus cash. So back on into things here, the Giants at the Falcons. Now, Malik Neighbors was resurrected last week like his name was the Undertaker, up against the Baltimore Ravens. That wasn't a pretty game to watch, I don't think anyone was excited to watch the Giants versus the Ravens, but Malik Neighbors was the wide receiver 9. He had 10 receptions on 14 targets for 82 yards and a touchdown. Now, the volume is always going to be there for Neighbors, and I would be shocked if he was healthy and honestly had less than 9 targets. With Horsecock Drew Lock seemingly back, I am fine ranking Neighbors as a mid-range wide receiver 2. I can't rank him much higher than that, though, because the offense just isn't good, but Neighbors' floor is solid just due to the fact that he's going to see so many targets. So I do feel confident in my ranking here. He is currently dealing with a knee/foot injury, but until we end up hearing that that's going to be more drastic, like the Park, or more drastic than I actually thought it was going to be here, I would not panic too much on that. For the rest of the Giants, it is actually crazy to me that Wan'Dale Robinson can get as many targets as he does and absolutely suck donkey cock, right? 9 and 11 targets over the last 2 weeks and just 7.8 PPR points scored in both of those games. He is dealing with a shoulder injury, and even if he plays, he is unstartable. Darius Slayton is one of those kind of guys that every once in a while, he's going to pop out like Puxtatani Phil and score 15 or maybe even 20 fantasy points. But with that big game not really happening since back in week 5, and with Neighbors and Robinson sucking in roughly 1 gazillion targets, Slayton belongs on the waivers. For the Falcons, Kirk Cousins has taken Drake London into the deep end recently and just drowned him, right? London had just 3 targets last week with 3 receptions for 53 yards and a touchdown as the wide receiver 28. The switch up to Michael Penix should be able to revive London into becoming a high-end wide receiver 2 weekly, and that is where I have him ranked this week up against the Giants. For Darnell, here comes the Mooney. He didn't have a single catch last week in Viva Las Vegas on Monday Night Football, and he had just 1 target in that game. I am hesitant to buy all the way in on Penix, saving both London and Mooney. So Mooney is more of a dart throw start at best for me because I do think that Penix is going to lock in onto Drake London. So Mooney is more of a low-end wide receiver 3 for me. And when it comes to Ray McCloud, it seemed like Kirk Cousins kind of had some weird affection for Ray. Deep down, he had that love affair, but I just don't think Penix probably has that with him, so I would be staying away. Next up, we got game number 5, the Detroit Lions at the Chicago Bears, the rematch from Thanksgiving. Now, Amon-Ra St. Brown put belt to ass last week up against the Buffalo Bills as the wide receiver number 2. 14 receptions on 18 targets for 193 yards and a touchdown. While I doubt that he will have this level of production up against the Bears because I don't think it's as likely to be that crazy of a shootout like up against the Bills, This could be a high-scoring game. St. Brown feels to me like a no-brainer top 8 wide receiver at this point in the season. And honestly, even with the ups and downs, you just kind of have to keep rocking with him. And facing up against a Bears defense that, while in the season, they might technically be good up against wide receivers, as of recently, that has not been the case. So I think you got to keep rocking with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, Jameson Williams has really slowed down over the last 4 games, with not a single game inside of the top 24. The reason why you play Jameson Williams isn't really for the safety, though. It's for that big boom upside. So putting J-Mo snugly in as a low-end wide receiver 3 feels right to me. Now, Tim Patrick is giving me gray hairs as a Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams owner. The bastard has 3 total touchdowns over the last 2 games and had a game back in week number 14 where he was the wide receiver number 8. I still don't think he's startable, but if you wanted to start him, at this point, I wouldn't really judge ya. For the Chicago Bears, wiki, DJ Moore has been getting targeted heavily over the last 3 weeks with 8 or more targets in all games. Now, his fantasy points haven't necessarily fallen suit with that. They haven't been the best, but with the Lions defense being incredibly banged up and with Moore finishing as the wide receiver 7 up against them last time out, the upside is there for a smash game out of DJ Moore. So I got him as a low-end wide receiver 2. Keenan Allen, despite the fact that this guy is old enough to have wandered the earth with the Flintstones, he is going to be able to potentially yabba dabba do all over the Detroit Lions defense. Inside of the last 4 games, he's been a top 5 wide receiver twice and a top 14 wide receiver thrice. Last time up against these 2 teams playing up against each other, it was Thanksgiving, like I already stated, and Keenan Allen feasted. Wide receiver 4 with 5 receptions on 8 targets for 73 yards and 2 touchdowns. Shout out to Keenan Allen. He was on my underdog team, promo code Notorious, that took down $250 on Thanksgiving on the Thanksgiving slate draft. So shout out to Keenan Allen. While I'm still skeptical of Allen as sandwiched in between those big games, he was the wide receiver 53, but with such good play as of recently, to me, he kind of just belongs as a high-end wide receiver 3. Now, while DJ Moore and Keenan Allen are kind of catching the balls thrown their way, they're having fun. It's like that meme, if anyone is a meme expert like myself, I'm a meme master. Shout out to Andy Salad. There's that meme of Squidward chilling in his fucking house, right? And he looks out the window, and SpongeBob and Patrick are having fun. That's what Roma Dunze is doing. He's looking at DJ Moore, he's looking at Keenan Allen, look at everyone having fun. But Roma Dunze is not having any fun, right? I still believe heavily in the player, and I know the upside is there, but when it comes to actually starting him, I just don't have any confidence in him, so I would be sitting him. Next up, we move to the Cleveland Browns at the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, Jerry Jeudy honestly doesn't get enough credit for completely turning his career around, doing a full 180. For years in Denver, me personally and a lot of people, shout out Steve Smith, were just completely fucking dogging this guy out for being a bust and not living up to my expectations or their expectations coming into the NFL draft. And, you know, I kind of wrote him off. Like, Jerry Jeudy sucks, let's be honest. And honestly, he has been playing phenomenally recently. Now, when it comes to this week, we have to put everything into consideration. We have to break everything down before we give the guy the Gawk Gawk 9000 special. Sure, he has played great. And sure, he is the clear wide receiver 1 on the team. But, and this is a big but, shout out to Kate Upton, while this matchup is beautiful, like Kate Upton's rack, DTR being the quarterback 1 instead of Jameis hurts like a butt cheek on a stick. So Jeudy is still startable, but the downgrade at quarterback has him in a high-end wide receiver 3 range instead of as a clear top 24 guy. Now with Jameis under center, you could talk yourself into Elijah Moore, but with DTR, I would not be willing to play Elijah Moore at all. I would be staying away. For Cedric Tillman, he practiced in limited fashion on Wednesday, but he is still in the concussion protocol. He could come back, but even if he does, with him missing 3 straight games and with Jeudy playing so well, and without Jameis, I would not be touching him. Pause. For the Cincinnati Bengals, Jamar Chase, you already know you're going to play him, right? Recently, and honestly, for what feels like a majority of the season, he has been the best wide receiver in the National Football League. Even with the Bengals being a complete and utter disaster of an organization, Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow are a duo like Batman and Robin, which is very fitting because if you guys watch Hard Knocks, which I don't really watch. I'm not like the biggest Hard Knocks guy, but I have been, I watched episode 1, I checked it out, and Joe Burrow brought the Batmobile from, I believe, The Dark Knight. So it really is Batman and Robin duo here. Chase cooled down slightly last week, but he still put up 18 fantasy points in PPR, 9 receptions on 11 targets for 94 yards. And while he didn't score a touchdown, the touchdowns have been going his way recently. So I don't think you need to be a fucking genius to figure out that Chase belongs as a top 3 wide receiver weekly. Teehee. Higgins, since returning from injury, has been a top 18 wide receiver in 3 of the last 4 games. Last week in Tennessee, he was the wide receiver 15 with 5 receptions on 8 targets for 88 yards and a touchdown. And while Jamar Chase is clearly the wide receiver you would prefer to have over the two, this isn't to discredit or diminish the value that T. Higgins has, because T. Higgins is amazing. And we all know that Higgins could outscore Jamar Chase in any given game. For example, last week is when that happened up against the Titans. So with the Bengals offense running like a well-oiled machine, I got T. Higgins as a high-end wide receiver too. Andre Yoshi-Voss is basically finished in fantasy when Chase and Higgins are both healthy. There's only one ball, and the ball just doesn't really find its way to Yoshi-Voss. And with it being so unlikely that a touchdown actually goes his way, I would be sitting him down. And at this point, if you got him, I would probably just cut him. Next up, we got game number 7 here, the Tennessee Titans at the Indianapolis Colts. Now, I'm going to keep this one simple. For the Colts, if Josh Downs and Pittman both play, which, Pittman's kind of just permanently banged up, so it's kind of, maybe he'll play, maybe he won't. They're both close to being starts. But they're close with no cigar, right? The biggest problem with both of them is I can't say I really have strong conviction on one over the other being the clear wide receiver 1. And I also don't trust Anthony Richardson at all. So for that reason, I would definitely be sitting both of them. Now, Alec Pierce is dealing with a concussion and may not end up playing. If he does not play, then A.D. Mitchell will slide in as the wide receiver 3. And if I'm not comfortable playing Josh Downs or Michael Pittman, you're definitely not comfortable playing Alec Pierce or A.D. Mitchell. For the Titans, Calvin Ridley has fucked us over so many times in a row that it honestly feels like the definition of insanity for me to actually start him again. But here we are, right? We're sitting here and I tell you to start him. The hope is that Mason Rudolph, the red-nosed reindeer, can save Ridley just like he ended up saving Christmas. Now, my personal expectations are at the bottom of the barrel, but it is possible that he plays decent. It's a good matchup, so to me, he's a mid-range wide receiver 3, but honestly, when push comes to shove and I actually put my rankings out on Patreon, or when you get the rankings video, he's ranked lower than that, like a low-end wide receiver 3. Don't be shocked, because I don't really like Calvin Ridley this week. For the other guys, we got Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. He's fallen, and he can't get up. He needs some fucking life alert. Back-to-back games outside the top 60, and with Rudolph under center, while I do believe that could actually save Ridley, I think that's less optimal for Nick Westbrook, so he's a clear sit for me. Tyler, Boyd is dealing with a foot injury. Even if he does end up playing, you aren't playing him. The man has played every game on the year. Every single game the Titans have played, he's been in, and he has just one game over 10 fantasy points. Next up, we got game number 8, a game that is interesting, where both of these offenses going to show up. Maybe none of them will, maybe one will, and the one will not. To be or not to be free of a curse. Shout out to Romeo and Juliet. So for the Rams, Puka Nacua has been on fire, like the dude who was on the cover of the Heroes and Villains album that Metro Boomin released. As of recently, last week was a snoozer of a game between the Rams and the 49ers, but Puka was still able to put up a decent enough game as the wide receiver 21, with 7 receptions on 8 targets for 97 yards and 2 carries for 11 yards. I love this spot up against the Jets for Puka, and I got him as a top 5 wide receiver. For Cooper Kupp, if you played him last week, you're probably walking a little bit funny due to how this man absolutely fucked you over. 3 targets for 0 receptions, just out there running sprints. Prior to that, he was a top 18 wide receiver, though, in 5 of the last 6. So if you include last week's game, 5 of the last 7. So do not worry about one down game, especially since the Jets defense has gotten penetrated as of recently. Kupp will be back on the saddle, like his name was Arthur Morgan, as a high-end option. So while he's not technically the cream of the crop, top 12 wide receiver, He's in the top 18. He's a mid-range wide receiver too. For Demarcus Robinson, back-to-back games with 1 target and 0 receptions. Robinson is keen to, every once in a while elbow drop the defense and be a top 28 guy. But ultimately, with his target share being so low, I do not want to play him in this spot. For the Jets, Davante Adams hit the Jaguars last week with a F5 in Jacksonville. Wide receiver 1 with 9 receptions on 12 targets for 198 yards and 2 touchdowns. Back-to-back games inside the top 7 and 3 straight coming out of the bye as a top 18 wide receiver. 4 total touchdowns in that stretch. So with Adams playing so well as of recently, I think he's going to, stretch out the Rams defense a little bit as a low-end wide receiver 1. Now, while Davante Adams has been 9 inches deep into defensive backs, Garrett Wilson has kind of been chilling in the cuck chair watching in the corner. Now, he has still been a startable wide receiver, so it hasn't been so much of a disaster. But Adams is kind of in the elite range, and Garrett Wilson just isn't there, in my opinion. With that said, Adams clearly needs to be ranked ahead of him at this point. Garrett Wilson is a solid low-end wide receiver too, but I am just nowhere near as excited to start him as I would be with Davante Adams. For Allen Lazard, this guy's a primetime merchant. When the game is in prime time or across the pond over in London, the guy pops off. But when the game is at 1 o'clock on a Sunday, the guy is silent like a Charlie Chaplin film. So since returning, he only has just 1 catch on 5 targets across 2 games. I would be staying away. Next up, we got game number 9 here. The Philadelphia Eagles at the Washington Commanders. Left hands up. Who are we? The Commanders. Now, A.J. Brown went balls deep into the Steelers last week as the wide receiver 8. 8 receptions on 11 targets for 110 yards and a touchdown. Last time these two teams played, A.J. Brown didn't have the best of showings as the wide receiver 36, but A.J. Brown is A.J. Brown, so we're going to expect him to have a better showing this time inside of the top 12. While A.J. Brown was putting belt to ass last week, Smith actually went even harder as the wide receiver 5. They kind of formed an Eiffel Tower in that game. 11 receptions on 12 targets for 109 yards and a touchdown. Back-to-back weeks with a touchdown. So Smith should be expected to just be a reliable wide receiver 2 going forward. This week, I got him as a low-end wide receiver number 2. For Jahan Dotson, it is a revenge game. And while it technically is a revenge game, there's a higher chance that you watching the game on the couch might just, catch a ball through the fucking TV and score a point. So you're going to sit Jahan Dotson. For the Commanders, Quinyon Mitchell has been strapping guys down like he has a pegging fucking addiction, right? Last time these two went up against each other, Terry versus Mitchell, Terry was in chains. And unlike Django, he couldn't get out. He was the wide receiver number 90. After this, Terry has been a top 8 wide receiver in the last 3 games, every single game. So we have kind of a real battle here. Will Terry be able to escape Quinyon, or is Quinyon going to strap him down yet again? Pause. Right? Quinyon has allowed just 152 total yards over the last 10 games. 152 total yards over the last 10 games. Now, I think most of you guys are still probably going to play him, and you're going to talk about the upside, and I get it. The expert consensus rankings have him as a top 12 wide receiver, but I don't have him ranked that high. I've got him as a low-end wide receiver 2. Dyami Brown, even with Noah Brown on IR, hasn't really sprouted like a beautiful butterfly and flourished. He hasn't scored more than 10 points since week 5, so I would not be playing either Olamide Zacchaeus or Brown, as neither guy have the clear wide receiver 2 role. Next up, we move to the Arizona Cardinals at the Carolina Panthers, the final game before the 4 p.m. slate. So if you've enjoyed so far, hit that subscribe button down below and leave a like. Now, starting Marvin Harrison Jr. feels like shoving your head into a beehive, but you're just allergic to bees. So most of the time, it's going to go terribly, but once in a blue moon, you kind of live to tell the tale, even if it's a stupid fucking tale, right? I'm a jackass who shoved his head into a beehive, but you kind of get that thrill, that adrenaline rush, and that's kind of what Marvin Harrison Jr. has. He has that adrenaline rush. He has that big upside. He's Marvin Harrison Jr., right? He's Marvin Harrison's son. He's great. Maserati Marv. But 3 of the last 4 games, coming out of the bye, he hadn't finished inside of the top 40. You're 40 years old. What you got a school bag for? You can't even read, right? This is a good spot for him. But with Harrison being as dependable as a condom with 3 holes in it, Marv is a low-end wide receiver 3. Big Mike Wilson, shout out to Shane Gillis, was the wide receiver 83 last week. Wilson should be able to score around 8 to 12 points, but at this point in the season, I do not feel that is startable, especially since he had just 5 total targets over the last 2 weeks. Greg Dortch, the short king, had a solid catch last week, but with him struggling to score 5 points in most games, I doubt anyone even has him on their team, so you gotta be sitting him. Now, Adam Thielen simmered down slightly as of recently. He still saw a healthy amount of volume, 5 receptions. I guess as of recently would be the wrong way to say it, because over the last 3 games, he's been great. It was just he simmered down more. Last week, 5 receptions on 7 targets for 51 yards as the wide receiver 38. Prior to that, back-to-back games inside the top 18. So Carolina's defense is underrated in my opinion. And by Carolina, I mean Cardinals defense. I don't know why the fuck I said Carolina. This is actually the classic battle of 2 teams that for some reason I just always mistake. I don't know why. We talked about it in the comment section one time, and I forgot why it was that. But I think it's just the fact that they're both like, I know it's the Arizona Cardinals and the Carolina Panthers, but they're both the CAR, and for some reason I'll just randomly mistake them and call them like the wrong name. Like people point that out for years. Like I'll be talking about the Panthers and I'll say like the Cardinals, or I'll be talking reversal and I'll say the opposite name. I don't know why that happens. It just always happens. So again, the Cardinals defense is underrated in my opinion. But, and this is a big but, shout out to Haley Bieber, with Thielen being much better as of recently, I do think you got to at least give him the credit as a mid-range wide receiver 3. For Jalen Coker, he was the wide receiver 12 last week with 4 receptions on 6 targets for 110 yards and a touchdown. And yeah, that 83-yard touchdown was awesome, but ultimately you can't depend on that on a weekly basis, and with Thielen being the guy, I would stay away from him. With Coker back, David Moore's kind of taking a back seat with his snaps dropping like they're hot, so no need to even keep him on your fantasy team. Next up, we got game number 11. Starting off the 4 p.m. slate, the cold-like Minnesota Vikings at the Seattle Seahawks. Now, Justin Jefferson's downward spiral from weeks 10 through 12 had my fantasy team grasping for air, and it got me eliminated from fantasy contention. Jefferson matched with a couple of other guys like Marvin Harrison shitting the bed, basically sunk my battleship. But for all of you guys that ended up surviving the great skid of Jefferson in 2024, you have been feeling real nicey over the last 3 games, 3 straight inside the top 22 and 2 games with over 20 fantasy points, while Sam Darnold is cooking like Remy with Ratatouille in his helmet in a fine spot up against Seattle. I love, because Jay Jett is makes me happy as a top 5 wide receiver. Jordan Addison-Ray has seen a strong target increase ever since week 11. He was typically a guy that early on in the year wasn't even a shoo-in to get like 5 targets, whereas since week 11, he has had 8 or more targets in 4 of 5 games. Now, the targets haven't always led to pure domination, but he has had 2 games inside the top 3 and 3 games inside the top 24. So up against Seattle, I do feel like he deserves a low-end top 24 ranking. For Jalen Nailor, with Hawkinson back in the fold, Nailor has been really not getting the ball, and he might not even get a single target, so I definitely think he should not be rostered. For the Seattle Seahawks, Geno Smith practiced today on Wednesday, as I'm recording this Wednesday night. It's actually technically Thursday. It's 12:09 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, but you get my point, right? If you are watching this on Thursday, he practiced on Wednesday, and the hope is that he practiced as obviously again on Thursday. With Sam Howell under center, things seem to be grim, but with Geno starting, I would feel a whole lot better. Last week up against the Packers, he was the wide receiver 20 with 10 receptions on 12 targets for 83 yards. JSN has been super reliable over the last 6 weeks, so while I don't think I can rank him inside the top 12, with the Vikings defense allowing the highest amount of points on a per-game basis to wide receivers, JSN belongs as a top 18 guy. Now, DK Metcalf to me is barely even a start at this point. With JSN ascending straight to outer space, Metcalf has faded away like a shot from Michael Jordan, right? Like I said with JSN, this is a mouth-watering matchup, but even so, with Metcalf scoring over 10 points just twice over the last 5 games, Metcalf is just a low-end wide receiver 3 desperation type of start. Now, Tyler Lockett in my pocket, skirt, has just 2 targets over the last 2 games. 2 targets. and hasn't been a top 60 wide receiver since prior to the bye week. Now, Lockett is now irrelevant in fantasy and belongs on your waivers. Next up, we got game number 12. Shout out to the 12th man. The New England Patriots at the no one circles the wagons like the Buffalo Bills. Now, Khalil Shakira has been hotter than a McDonald's coffee on that lady's lap back in the 90s. Back-to-back games inside the top 24. Last week in Detroit, he was the wide receiver 24 with 6 receptions on 7 targets for 39 yards and a touchdown. Throughout the season as a whole, Shakir has been a reliable high-end wide receiver 3 to low-end wide receiver 2 this week in a solid spot up against the Patriots. The problem here, that lies with me not giving him a top 24 nod is that this doesn't feel like a back and forth game, right? This doesn't feel like a hung, right? Back and forth fucking Usyk versus Tyson Fury, right? A back and forth affair. This kind of feels like it might be an early knockout, an early KO by the Bills. So with that said, I don't think this could be like a super high scoring game where like Josh Allen really has to throw for 1 billion yards. So Shakir gets enough targets. He'll be a nice high-end wide receiver 3, but I do think his upside is capped because of that. Now, Amari Cooper followed up his wide receiver 24 performance in week 14 in LA up against the Rams with him just running around as the wide receiver number 1,000 last week. He had 46% of the snaps played and 0 targets. With Keon Coleman back, Amari Cooper belongs on the pine. Keon returned and outsnapped Cooper with 63% of the snaps, but with just 1 catch on 2 targets for 64 yards. And here I would just be staying away. For the Patriots, Demario Douglas scored last week in Arizona and barely even eclipsed 10 fantasy points. He scored 10.1 in PPR. 3 receptions on 3 targets for 11 yards with the touchdown. Even in a positive matchup up against the Buffalo Bills, every single Patriots wide receiver is a clear sit. None of them are clearly it's not like Douglas is the clear wide receiver 1, like Booty could out-target him. Bourne could out-target him. So it's like, why even bother playing the fucking guessing game here, even up against the Bills defense? Next up, we got the Jacksonville Jaguars at the Viva Las Vegas Raiders. Now, even with Mac Jones under center, Brian Thomas Jr. has been feasting like a Game of Thrones character in the books, as that fat bastard George R.R. Martin describes every single molecule of a turkey leg. If you've ever read those books, or listen to the audiobooks, you would know George R.R. Martin literally is probably jerking off about the food that he's writing about. And that's why the guy hasn't finished the fucking series, because he's a lazy bastard. BTJ has had 10 or more targets in 3 straight games coming out of the bye and 0 finishes outside the top 20. Last week up against the Jets, he had him screaming uncle. He had him calling him fucking daddy. 10 receptions on 14 targets for 105 yards and not 1 but 2 touchdowns in that game. The Raiders are middle of the road up against wide receivers, so with BTJ playing so well as of recently, I will give him the Gawk 9000 special as a high-end wide receiver 2. For the rest of the guys for the Jaguars, Parker Washington had the game of his career back in week 13 up against the Texans as the wide receiver 5, but ever since then, it's been all downhill. His targets are fluctuating heavily, and with my 0 trust in Mac Jones to hit anyone outside of Brenton Strange and Brian Thomas Jr., I would be staying away. That also means the horseman, Devin Duvernay, is a clear sit. For the Raiders, Jacoby Myers ranking heavily relies on the health of Aiden O'Connell. If AOC can suit up, I would be far more confident in Jacoby Myers compared to if Desmond Ridder was under center. Aiden O'Connell was back at practice on Wednesday with the knee, so this is something to clearly monitor. Because with Aiden O'Connell, you can talk yourself into a good game out of Jacoby Myers. I'm not talking about like wide receiver 8 game, but like a fine game. But with Ridder, doesn't seem the best, right? Last week, he was the wide receiver 36 against the Falcons on Monday Night Football. 5 receptions on 9 targets for 59 yards. If Aiden O'Connell is under center, then Jacoby is a high-end wide receiver 3 up against a Jaguars defense that allows the 4th highest amount of points on a per-game basis to wide receivers. If the Rizzler, Desmond Ridder, is the quarterback 1, even in a great spot, might not even start him. For Trey Tucker, I barely knew her. He had 2 receptions on 3 targets for 18 yards. Even without DJ Turner, there's really nothing to get excited about here. All the non-Jacoby Myers wide receivers are relevant in fantasy, so I would be sitting them all. Next up, we move to the San Francisco 49ers at the Miami Dolphins. Miami Dolphins, number 1. Even though they're not number 1, they fucking suck. Fuck. Man, does that hurt as a Dolphins fan. I thought this was finally the year. I don't know why every year I just think, this is the year. Actually, that's a lie. Because there's a lot of years where I think it's not the year. This year, I talked myself into it. I was like, you know what? They'll figure it out. They'll beat good teams. They'll figure it out. And then Tua gets whacked. It's like, fuck. And then he comes back and it's like, okay, we're losing, but things are looking promising. Like, we're keeping it close. And then that Texans game just really, it hurt. It hurt. And there's still technically a chance we can make the playoffs. So I'm going to keep rooting for the Dolphins. But, we all know they're not making the playoffs, right? Let's be honest. So Jawan Jennings last week hit his fantasy owners with a 5-knuckle shuffle last week like his name was John Cena. 2 receptions on 9 targets for 31 yards, and the whole 49ers offense was limp dick up against the Rams, and there was no Viagra to be found, right? Assuming that Purdy and the offense does look better, though, Jennings should be able to bounce back as a low-end wide receiver, too, even if the matchup on paper isn't great. As a Dolphins fan, I know Jennings is going to find a whole lot of holes in our defense, and the Dolphins defense has more holes than a fucking piece of Swiss cheese, right? Deebo Samuel has been so bad. If you said, Nick, I'm cutting him, I wouldn't even judge. This motherfucker hasn't scored more than 10 fantasy points since week 10. And we are talking about a game that is over a month ago. Even with him getting fed 7 targets last week, he had 3 receptions for 16 yards and 2 rushes for 3 yards. Even with him complaining on Twitter, I'm not getting the ball enough, he still stinks. Even if he gets 1,000,000 targets, he's not going to do anything. So I would rather go toe-to-toe with John Jones after he was on a coke bender over starting Deebo Samuel. Slick Ricky Pearsall was the wide receiver 91 last week, and he had 1 great game this season, and I like Ricky, and I think most people are rooting for him after he ended up getting shot, but he legitimately could score 0 points this week, so you're not going to play him. For the Dolphins, I really felt like Tyreek was back in the good graces of fantasy football players, right? 3 top 12 performances in a 4-game stretch from weeks 11 through 14, and everything's on the up and up. It's like, okay, we got it. It's time. Good matchup against the Texans. I like it. I like it. I like it. And then Tyreek hit us with Master Splinter's wooden cane last week as the wide receiver 65. Tua and Tyreek were not only on the wrong page, they were in 2 different fucking books. One was reading nonfiction, the other one was reading fiction, right? Someone was reading The Diary of the Wimpy Kid, and Tua was reading a book about dinosaurs, right? 2 completely different things. This matchup is bad, but Tyreek is Tyreek, so he should bounce back as a high-end wide receiver too, but I won't, get too high on him because I don't want to disappoint you again. Now, Waddle did not practice on Wednesday with a knee injury that knocked him out of a bunch of the game last week in Houston. He had 0 receptions on 2 targets, and you guessed it, 0 yards. Waddle is considered day-to-day, so he could end up playing regardless, though. Coming off the injury, I think this is a spot where you want to stay away. If Waddle is out, and with Odell Beckham Jr. just leaving, Washington will operate as the wide receiver too. He actually led the team in receiving last week with 5 receptions on 6 targets for 52 yards, and I like Malik, and I'm excited to what he can do as a Dolphins fan, but let's be honest, you're not playing Malik Washington this week. Next up, we got "Cause You Waited All Day for Sunday Night," Baker Mayfield versus Cooper Rush. Baker Mayfield and the entire Bucs offensive coaching staff appears to be 100% dialed in on getting Mike Evans to 1,000 yards, right? Something that he has done 10 straight times, going for number 11. With 3 games remaining inside of the season, including this week, he's going to need 251 total receiving yards to hit that marker. To get 1,000, and then obviously more, 252, to surpass 1,000. Last week, he had the Chargers defense stuck in a washing machine like a stepsister on the other tube, right? Wide receiver 3 in LA, 9 receptions on 11 targets for 159 yards and not 1 but 2 touchdowns. With the Cowboys defense allowing the 9th most amount of points on a per game basis to wide receivers, Magic Mike Evans should let his nuts hang this week as a mid-range wide receiver 1. Now, Jalen McMillan has officially learned how to catch the football. Back-to-back games inside the top 18, and last week he had 5 receptions on 6 targets for 75 yards and a touchdown, with 3 total touchdowns over the last 2 games. I still am hesitant to really, be the conductor of the Jalen McMillan bandwagon, to truly throw the crown on his head, Biggie Smalls. But with his play as of recently, and with this being a great matchup, shout out Tony the Tiger, McMillan is a low-end wide receiver 3 for me. With McMillan getting a bigger piece of the pie in the offense as of recently, General Shepard will not be getting as many targets and not as many points. He had just 1 target last week. I would not be willing. start him. And next up, we move to the Cowboys here. Over the last 2 weeks, CeeDee Lamb has ripped off 2 big games in a row as the top 11 wide receiver. Last week in Carolina, he was the wide receiver 6 with 9 receptions on 13 targets for 116 yards and a touchdown. The Buccaneers defense gets annihilated by wide receivers on a per-game basis. So even with Cooper Rush under center, the Lambster should be able to rack up a top 6 performance on the week. For the other guys, Brandon Cooks has scored a touchdown in 2 of the last 3 games. But even with those touchdowns, he only has scored over 10 fantasy points once. Even a solid matchup here, his production is just not good enough for me to start him. Jalen Tolbert will see anywhere from 2 to 4 targets, and with Cooks being back and, his touchdown equity being higher than Tolbert's, kind of just a no-brainer that you wouldn't want to play him. Final game here, Monday Night Football, the Saints at the Green Bay Packers. Now, Jaden Riley-Reed, in my opinion, is just a straight-up YOLO start. And what I mean by that is that he's a guy with 0 safety that you just say, fuck it, I need super high upside, I'm going to play him, right? And we know he has 0 safety because in Week 14, he scored 0 fantasy points. The upside is there, right? Because he's on the Packers, the offense could run up the score. But again, he has 0 safety, so he's just a high-end wide receiver 4 at best. For the other guys, I just said for the other guys multiple times. That's a movie. For the other Packers, Dobbs had 2 tugs last week like he was Deshaun Watson at a massage parlor. 3 receptions on 5 targets for 40 yards in Seattle, with Love spreading the ball around so heavily. I make this joke all the time, but he's like, Oprah, you get the ball, check under your seat because you, the viewer, also get the fucking ball, right? None of these guys are trustworthy, but the upside is there for them all. Same thing with Watson, the upside is there, but with Dobbs now back, I would not be advocating for him. For the 49ers, it's late, it's 12:22. AM, so, make sure you guys hit that fucking subscribe button. I'm sacrificing my sleep. I should be sleeping. I should be hitting the Z's. I should be counting the sheep, but I'm here recording for you guys. Without Derek Carr, MVS, Marquise Valdes-Scantling, has been banished to the pine. Unstartable in my opinion, and if I'm not playing MVS, I'm 100% not playing some guy named Kevin Austin Jr. or Cedric Wilson Jr. Thank you guys all so much for watching. If you didn't enjoy, please make sure you do hit that subscribe button down below. It does help me out a ton. Make sure you guys do hit that like button. Check out Underdog if you are new. Promo code Notorious to get your free pick plus a first-time deposit offer of up to $1,000 in bonus cash. Check out one of the videos on your screen if you haven't seen them already. And we'll definitely be back tonight live at around 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time prior to the kickoff of Thursday Night Football. I love you a long time. Hope you have a great one. And as always, good boy!